Good afternoon. We're so sorry that the 6 of the authors could not make it to the conference. Sad, but inspirational that we have to make this presentation through remote channels. This kind of connection would have been impossible 20 years ago. This brings us back to the history of the digital humanities and the history of the digital humanities in Russia. We set to find out the history first because it demonstrates the scope of cultural and intellectual diversity in the digital humanities and gives us an opportunity to trace lost opportunities, roads not taken, those that could be pursued if we get back and understand if we could start them again. This was done through close reading, linking from other texts and looking what other people had referenced. But in addition, we also grouped people around concepts and methodologies, or methodologies around people, as it led to the infrastructure in the digital humanities in Russia. And of course, we juxtaposed concepts, methodologies, and research groups. The history of the digital humanities in Russia is related to mathematics and sciences more than anything else. It was not related to anthropology or social sciences as it happened in Europe or the United States. And it was very much related to the formalist movement with its famous concepts of estrangement and art as a technique, which led to developing this, looking at structures in literary artworks. Structuralism, or rather pre-structuralism, started in the frames of Moscow Linguistic Circle, with Roman Jacobson as its chair. One of the members of Moscow Linguistic Circle was Boris, who looked at the structures as a reflection of literature and a system of proportions and relations between the properties. What is more, he looked at how these structures developed across time and genres, and whether it could be compared to the development of life as it was understood in the 20s and the 30s. This led him to modeling processes together with developing data models. And this was related to variety, mutability, and continuity as understood by Ferdinand de Saussure. This tradition continued further to the 40s and 60s when another famous mathematician, Andrey Kolmogorov, worked in poetry studies and looked at meter and rhythm and how meter changes, how rhythm changes across authors, genre, and poetic works. Another approach that was also incorporated in Boris Yerhol's work was systems approaches, when he said that the foundations of his principles was looking at complex systems and biology. Andrei Lipunov in the 50s and 70s did about the same when he related machine translation to systems approaches. He did the same for biology. From the point of view of infrastructure, after Moscow Linguistic Circle stopped functioning in the 20s, and Roman Jacobson left for Prague, where he joined Prague Linguistic Circle and later Copenhagen Linguistic Circle and later New York Linguistic Circle, nothing happened in terms of infrastructure and developed research groups in Russia where researchers worked separately. It only happened in the 50s and 60s when Andrey Kolmogorov started Moscow seminar on quantitative methods and poetry studies, and Andrey Lipunov started his seminars on cybernetics and machine translation linked to linguistic computing. Later on, in the 80s, Andrei Yershov, Lipunov's student, looked at developing data models and computerized corpus of the Russian language as a prerequisite for doing other works in linguistic computing. This resulted in developed foundations for the Russian national corpus, which was completed by 2004. In terms of other institutions working with new data models or data models based on old classifications but adapted for machine processing, was also work at the State Hermitage Museum in the 80s when Jacob Scher tried to adapt new data models to machine requirements. Current experiments with data models of institutional character are done at Tolstoy Museum and the High School of Economics in Moscow, where they produce data models for a digital scholarly edition of Tolstoy complete works. Relation of Russian experience to the Western digital humanities is, of course, coping with confirmation bias and looking for samples and evidence to support a hypothesis in the humanities. It is also very much about research design that is in line with the requirements of the age of structuralism and which supports interpretation of artworks with patterns of structural elements. There were plenty of similarities, of course, studying poetry and patterns in poetry in the early 20th century, and interest in building data models for folklore studies at about the same period. Quantitative approaches to literary studies, machine translation, linguistic computing, digitizing textual and visual objects in the 90s, and of course the Russian national corpus in the early years of this century. The differences were very much about the context of mathematics and sciences. This also related to the infrastructures that were built around research groups led by mathematicians or people working in sciences. That was very important for the development of the digital humanities in Russia, which was seldom linked to anthropology or social sciences. Few scholars and even fewer institutions experimented with data models and developing new classification schemas. Another important difference is integrative thinking that relies on feedback, regulation, and systems approaches that was developed in the 60s and the 70s, although the first examples could be found in Yerhov's works of the 20s and 30s. This means that Russian digital humanities could be very much about how to incorporate biological approaches and systems approaches in the digital humanities. It is also very much about experience of studying poetry and working on the poetry corpus as a part of the national corpus of the Russian language. It is also about recent experiments with data models, mostly concentrated around research group at the High School of Economics. This means that Russian contribution to the digital humanities is about biology studies and systems approaches, which potentially have a lot to contribute to the digital humanities. All these alternative histories or paths not taken are inspirational and can bring us to understand the digital humanities from a different perspective and think about developing two different directions. Thank you so much.